Hello, and welcome to another edition of Synoptic Gospels Online with Life Pacific University. Today we're going to be talking about the death and resurrection of Christ. And we've talked a little bit about this already in Historical Jesus and, what we can know historically, but we're going to brush up on that again. I find this to be particularly helpful because a lot of times we disconnect biblical history with, quote-unquote normal history. And we kind of think of biblical events happening, but, maybe they did or didn't happen, and then real events, right? And you may not articulate it that way, but I find a lot of times that there is that sort of a disconnect. And so when we can connect these two and recognize that, these events in the Bible legitimately happened in actual history, especially the crucifixion, I find that this can be really helpful. So to start with, let's talk about the Passion Week, leading up to the crucifixion. Jesus, on the night before his crucifixion, shared a Passover meal with his closest followers. And for first century Jews, the Passover pointed both back to the Exodus from Egypt and ahead to the new promised Exodus. And so there's this sort of pointing back, pointing forward kind of idea going on. At the supper, Jesus identifies his body with the bread and his blood with the wine, signifying that his death would be the sacrifice that would bring about the new covenant and the return from exile. Then he's betrayed, and I often use some of the verses from the betrayal here as examples of why we shouldn't just sort of use the open the Bible at random approach to interpreting the Bible, because you can open the Bible at random and it says Judas went and hung himself, and then go ye and do likewise, and then what you must do quickly, right? And so just by using Judas there, we can see that kind of opening it at random 3 times in a row could yield really disastrous results. And so we want to avoid that. That's a bad idea. So after the betrayal, Jesus is charged, and he's sent to a Roman governor and charged with sedition as a rebel against Rome. Jewish authorities' motivations in handing him over were due to multiple factors. Many saw him as a false prophet who was leading Israel astray. They saw his temple action as a blow against the central symbol of both national life and Yahweh's presence with his people, and he saw himself as, in some sense, a messiah and could thus become a focus of serious revolutionary activity. They see him as a dangerous political nuisance whose actions might call down the wrath of Rome upon temple and nation alike. And at his hearing, he not only pleaded guilty to the above charges, but also placed himself blasphemously alongside the God of Israel. Especially in Mark's Gospel, we see this as perhaps the most clear indication of Jesus claiming to be God, because you have the high priest saying, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus responds, "Ego me, I am." This is the reference to Exodus 3:14, where God says, "I am that I am." He says, "Ego me, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." This is reference not only to Daniel chapter 7, but also Psalm 110. And tying all of these passages together, Jesus has the law in Exodus, he has the prophets in Daniel, and he has the writings in the Psalms. Though there is some debate about whether to place Daniel in the writings or in the prophets. Nonetheless, he's pulled together these 3 passages and unified them into one, that we have Yahweh as the Son of Man, and yet also distinct from the Son of Man somehow. In Psalm 110:1, the Lord said to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And so this is a very clear indication of Jesus claiming to be God. Well, the Jewish leadership and the Jerusalem Jews are traditionally blamed for Jesus' crucifixion. And so we have to be really careful here that we aren't just making this a Christians versus Jews sort of thing. We have to recognize that the earliest Christians are Jews, and so this is a Jew versus Jew thing, right? So this isn't the Jews do something bad and the Christians do something good. That is a false dichotomy. The Christians are Jews. They are Messianic Jews. They believe in Jesus as the Messiah, but they're ethnically Jewish. And so it's not that the Jews are evil and the Christians are good. The earliest Christians are Jews. Just read Acts, right? So we have to be really careful here. And the reason that I make this point is that this has, in fact, led to some, not some, but a lot of anti-Semitism in history. Much of the anti-Semitism in history has been Christian, which is just tragic. Just to give one example, Martin Luther, who is often lauded for the Reformation, also wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lives. And a lot of his success in the Reformation was a result of German nationalism. And that German nationalism mixed with his anti-Semitism leads to, pretty directly, to Nazi theology. Because you end up with German nationalism and anti-Semitism, and it's cloaked in sort of this pseudo-Christianity. So we have to be really careful here that we're not just making the Jews out to be bad people, because in fact our forebears in the faith are Jews, right? That we come from a Jewish sect in the first century. So we want to be really careful there. Recently and accurately, there's been a trend to shifting this towards blaming the Romans, which is more accurate. Whether the Jews bring Jesus to the Romans or not, right? Like, perhaps you can say that the Jewish leadership is responsible for Jesus dying, which would be accurate, but they're not directly responsible for it because they don't have the authority to kill anyone. And so the Romans are the ones that killed Jesus. And so we have to be really careful when we're doing this work and be mindful of the history of interpretation here and what that has done. Most contemporary scholars reject sort of an either-or solution as a result, and so they affirm sort of a joint responsibility that you have the Jewish people bringing them to the Romans, and then the Romans therefore kill Jesus. But again, we just want to be really careful here that we are not becoming guilty of anti-Semitism, right? This long history of anti-Semitism having Christian roots is something that we want to be very careful to avoid, okay? And so, in conclusion here, there's a mixture of religious and political issues, and these two are essentially inseparable in the first century, especially within Judaism. Okay, and so these are the circumstances for Jesus' death. This image that we have here, this is actually a archaeological find of a crucified ankle bone with the nail still stuck in the ankle bone. Okay, and so this gives you kind of an idea of the pain endured in crucifixion, that we would have nails going through someone's bone to such an extent that thousands of years later the nail would still be fused to the bone, right? And so to give us some insight into crucifixion itself, some historical quotes here. Out of rage and hatred, the soldiers nailed their prisoners in different postures, and so great was their number that space could not be found for a cross. This is Josephus talking about a mass crucifixion around the time of Jesus. And when we see here that crucifixion was not unilaterally in the traditional shape of the T that we sort of expect, but rather crucifixion was often in other postures. And so there's times when people are crucified in the shape of an X, and sometimes that it's just a simple pole and your arms are above you and feet below you, and so it's just straight up on a pole. And so crucifixion is a pretty nasty thing. Right, Josephus here talking about massive crucifixion. If memory serves, it's been a while since I read about this, but I believe there's 2,000 people crucified in one of the mass crucifixion events, and so some pretty just nasty occurrence. Cicero calls crucifixion that most cruel and disgusting penalty. And later in another work says that the very word cross should be far removed not only from the person of a Roman citizen, meaning that Roman citizens should not be crucified, which is the case. Roman citizens could not be crucified. But also from the citizens' thoughts, eyes, and ears. And so a Roman citizen should not even hear the word cross, let alone see someone crucified or hear somebody crucified or think about someone being crucified, because it's so abhorrent that it should be reserved from them. And then Pilate. Pilate is our person who's responsible from Rome for crucifying Jesus. You can see here from Josephus, when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified. And we see in this image here, if you look at just this part right here, you can kind of see the P, the I, L, A, and then T, and then generally U is made as a V. And so you see Pilatus here. And so that's Pilate, right? This is archaeological evidence for the existence of Pilate. And then Tacitus tells us that Nero fastened the guilt of the burning of Rome, which was actually Nero's fault. He set Rome aflame so that he could rebuild it, but then blames it on the Christians. And it inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by their populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate. And you can actually see as well above this, you can actually see what is potentially Tiberius as well above Pilate on this inscription. The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rights and was crucified on that account. This is Lucian of Samosata. He is a satirist and playwright. On the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged. Then we have John Dominic Crossan, who is a skeptic, or perhaps better to say on the far liberal edge of Christianity. I don't know how the best way to classify him would be, but he's done some work on historical Jesus in scholarship, and he says that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. So we know without a doubt that Jesus is crucified. But in him being crucified, there's some potentially confusing things. We've got some riddles, we might say, on the cross. And these riddles in the Gospels, Jesus speaks of his forthcoming death and numerous passion predictions. And this death would be a realistic expectation for someone who provoked the authorities as much as Jesus did. A number of these sayings evoke images from Jewish scriptures that suggest that Jesus symbolized the fate of Israel in himself and would suffer to turn away divine wrath so that Israel could be released from exile and enjoy the freedom of a new Exodus. These sayings are markedly different from the atonement theology of the later church, and as a result are most likely authentic. These are not things that later Christians would likely insert into the Gospels. They don't make a lot of sense in light of later atonement theology or later Christian statements. So when we look at these statements, Jesus predicting his death, we have three synoptic predictions of Jesus' death after Peter's confession. There's some evidence here for historicity rather than later invention. One of these would be the use of Son of Man, which is historically characteristic. This is Jesus' favorite statement or favorite name for himself, but it does not line up with later Christian writings. If you look at Paul never calls Jesus Son of Man. If you look at the early church very rarely calls Jesus Son of Man. So this is not something that they would invent. Jesus does not reference the cross explicitly in these predictions, and there's no expression of explicit atonement theology in these predictions. So you would think that if Christians were inventing these predictions, they wouldn't use Son of Man, they would explicitly mention the cross, and they would start to develop atonement theology. But that's not what we see. The combination of what Jesus said at the Last Supper and his riddles on the cross show that Jesus regarded his approaching death as the climax of his vocation. Jesus saw his vocation spelled out in the figures of Isaiah's servant, the smitten shepherd of Zechariah, the righteous one of the Psalms, and perhaps even the Maccabean martyrs, which is one of the reasons why reading the Apocrypha is a good idea, even if we don't consider it scripture, because there does seem to be some background there. Jesus believed that Israel's exile had reached its climax, and he was the bearer of Israel's destiny, who would suffer the final loss on behalf of the people so that the exile could come to an end. And in him, Israel could become the light of the world that God had always intended. Jesus' perspective on his coming death, we can see his Eucharistic words in the Last Supper. Jesus' body is the new Passover lamb, and this is where we start to get our atonement theology. Jesus' blood and the new covenant, which is alluding to Jeremiah 31 and also Ezekiel 36, I believe. Eschatological new covenant brings forgiveness and personal knowledge of God. And there's a likely identification here with the suffering servant. Jesus says in Matthew 26, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sin." And Isaiah 53 verse 12 says, "Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors." So there seems to be a connection here between what Jesus is saying and the suffering servant. We also have a ransom saying in Mark 10:45, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The authenticity of this has been challenged. It's assumed that it's impossible, but it fits well within the overall portrait that's been developed of this self-conscious Messiah, especially in Mark. Jesus' self-identification as a servant, offering himself as a ransom for the many, also strongly echoes Isaiah's servant of the Lord. And so we may conclude that it is likely that Jesus not only foresaw his death, but moved to make it happen, interpreting it in light of the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, sacrificial act of atonement for the sins of his people. The atonement then, as a whole, usually kind of that term is used as sort of a shorthand for Jesus' ministry, especially for what Jesus does on the cross. And this is what makes salvation possible. That's the foundation of all of the other major doctrines. Emil Brunner said, "He who understands the cross aright understands the Bible, he understands Jesus Christ." So Brunner here is connecting the cross with virtually everything else. If you get the cross right, you get everything else right. And I don't agree with everything that Brunner says, but I 100% agree with him here. I think you got to start with the cross and understand everything else through that. So our doctrines of God and our doctrines of humanity will influence and be influenced by our doctrine of the atonement. If we overemphasize Jesus' divinity and downgrade his humanity, that's going to impact how we understand the atonement. If we do the opposite and overemphasize his humanity and downplay his divinity, it's going to impact our understanding of the atonement. So what we want to do, we want to have a proper Christology that holds these two in tension, that Jesus is fully God and fully man, according to the Council of Chalcedon, and hold those in tension, the hypostatic union of Jesus, the union of those two natures in one person. And we want to understand the atonement in light of that. Really great thing for you to read on this, if you're interested, is On the Incarnation by Athanasius, written in the 4th century. Does a really great job of explaining why Jesus has to be God and also has to be man. So some of the theories of the atonement, we're not going to go over these in great detail. You should be able to get this in your theology class. But while we're talking about it, just so you're aware, there are several different approaches to explaining what is happening in the atonement. The Socinian theory, for instance, is the atonement as an example. Jesus is an example for us. The moral influence theory is the atonement as a demonstration of God's love for us. So Jesus is showing us the extent of how much God loves us. The governmental theories, the atonement as a demonstration of justice, and so God is sort of the cosmic government in this theory, and what happens on the cross is he executes judgment upon Jesus, so that justice can be served, so that the rest of us can be set free. The ransom theory is the atonement is victory over sin and evil, and so Jesus, in dying for us, ransoms us back from sin and evil, sometimes ransoming us back from Satan, depending on who is articulating that theory. And then the satisfaction theory is that God himself requires payment for something. And so these are some of the different theories. There's other theories, there's Christus Victor, substitutionary atonement, and lots of other theories, just to give you kind of a sample here of some of the different ways that the atonement is thought about. Okay. Another important thing to think through here is, for whom did Christ die? one of the ways of thinking about this is that it is efficacious for all and effective for some. This is one theological framework for understanding that Jesus has died for everyone, but salvation is not applied to everyone. One of the reasons why not everybody makes it. Another approach to this would be particular atonement, that Jesus only dies for some. This would be what is referred to as Calvinistic theology or Reformed theology, limited atonement, right? That Jesus only dies for those who are elect or who are chosen. This is not something that we're going to hold to in the Foursquare Church. We're going to hold to unlimited atonement, so to speak, unlimited atonement or universal atonement, that Jesus dies for everyone. But we're going to explain it in terms of everyone. Jesus has died for everyone, but that doesn't mean that everyone is saved, right? And so, again, this is something that you're going to unpack in your theology classes, but just want to kind of give you a brief overview of this here so that you're at least aware of the conversations. So, the resurrection, and we're going to go through this briefly. Like I said, we've gone through this in other presentations as well. We'll go through this again here. Also, just really love this artwork here, the carving, because Jesus is sort of like just kind of, evading Mary. So the Latin above this is he's saying, "Don't cling to me," right? This is Jesus after the resurrection when he tells Mary in the garden, "Don't cling to me, for I've not yet ascended." And so I just love the motion there, that it's sort of like he's sliding away. Just I think it's awesome. So. A couple of videos here that you can watch. I'll leave them in the PowerPoint so you can watch them later on your own. This is N.T. Wright on the resurrection. And so this is just a fantastic video to listen to one of the best New Testament scholars in the world on the resurrection. And just by way of citing my sources, a lot of my PowerPoints have come from N.T. Wright and Michael Bird's excellent The New Testament and Its World. The rest of it has come from our textbook of Four Portraits, One Jesus. Then the origins of Easter. So what's going on in Easter? Again, we have my excellent carving here of Jesus sort of dodging Mary. Just gotta love it. Several aspects of the Easter stories in the Gospels show signs of reflecting much earlier tradition. These are things that we would expect someone to embellish. We would expect somebody to, add things in here to sort of make them fantastic. And we see that precisely in some of the Gnostic Gospels. In the Gospel of Peter, you have the Jesus emerges from the tomb and the cross comes out with him. And you hear a voice from heaven saying, "Have you preached to those who are asleep?" And the cross itself answers. This is the kind of embellishment that you would expect in a later gospel. We don't see these in the canonical gospels. The burial of Jesus and the discovery of the empty tomb can be regarded as historically solid for a variety of reasons. We're pretty confident with those. Stories reflect a mixture of eyewitness enthusiasm and strange bewilderment as to what exactly happened. And the wide breadth of people who saw Jesus is impressive. And so we have some pretty good reasons to believe that these things are historically accurate. It's hard to explain why the early church claimed Jesus had risen from the dead if they had intended to describe a hallucination, a vision, or a vague belief that Jesus had ascended post-mortem into a heavenly realm. There's a big difference between someone appearing to you as a ghost, which they would sort of expect. I mean, you can see this in Acts when Peter is released from prison and shows up. They say, well, perhaps it's his spirit, right? He's died and his spirit is coming to let us know that he's gone on and that he's safe. That's the kind of thing that they would expect. But instead, they're staking this claim that Jesus is bodily raised, that he didn't just sort of appear as this, ephemeral ghost, but rather he has been raised bodily. The stories don't make any mention of the Christian future hope. The depiction of the risen Jesus has not yet been influenced by Jewish writings about the resurrection, mostly because there aren't really any. You can get the idea of resurrection maybe from Daniel 12, and then also maybe from Isaiah 25 and 26, but there's not this widespread notion of the resurrection in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Instead, you have this idea of a resurrection on the very last day, right? And so you see this in John chapter 11 with Martha saying, I know that my brother will rise on the last day. There's this notion of a final resurrection, not a notion of the Messiah resurrecting from the dead. And so for the claim of Jesus' resurrection to develop, there must have been both an empty tomb and appearances to the disciples of the risen Jesus. And so here's a summary of the resurrection in Matthew. We get earthquakes and we get angels. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but it's here for you if you're interested in looking at this. We also have Mark. We have the fear and trembling in Mark, and so there's some distinction there between that and Matthew. And then in Luke, we have burning hearts and broken bread. This is referring to the story of the road of Emmaus. And so these are distinct stories about the resurrection from different perspectives. This is one of the ways that we can see that the gospel authors are shaping things in different ways. Matthew wants to see this sort of apocalyptic situation of earthquakes and end of the age kind of stuff. Mark wants to communicate to his likely persecuted audience that they wouldn't be the only people who would respond to all of these things with fear, right? That the initial disciples who have experienced the resurrection were afraid, and that it's okay to be a follower of Jesus and yet be apprehensive. And then Luke, the Savior of the world, wants to explain that Jesus is making himself approachable. Jesus shows up to the people walking to Emmaus and explains himself to them. They don't even realize who he is. And so Jesus is going out of his way to make himself approachable and understandable and relatable. And so these three different perspectives, they're not conflicting, but they're emphasizing different things to help us understand their gospel story the way that they want us to understand their gospel story. We have another video here from Dr. Wright, and then one more final video here from the eminent N.T. Wright. And these videos, you don't have to watch these, but I've included them here because they're just so remarkably good. In our next video, we'll be talking about the thematic study. I'll go through in brief some examples of what I'm looking for in the thematic study, and then that'll wrap up the course. So just want to say, really have appreciated having you in this course. I hope that that it's been helpful for you, not only in your education, but also in your walk with Christ, that you have developed as a disciple in this course, that you've grown closer to the Savior in this course, and that you appreciate Him on a new level that you have not experienced previously. And so, Father, I just pray for these students that you would bless them richly in their studies, that you would give them rest, that you would give them peace, and that you would encourage them as we wrap up this semester and as we go into new courses in the coming weeks, and that you would refresh them and that you would remind them while they're studying these things, so that, Lord, that they would be encouraged by you to push on and to continue to be workmen that do not need to be ashamed, who are rightly dividing your word of truth. Lord, we ask this not just for them, and Lord, not just for the people that they'll minister to, but God, for the sake of your name, for the sake of your kingdom, for the sake of your glory, in the name of your precious Son.